Motorcycles have always been a big part of my life, sometimes too big, but it wasn't always that way. At one time, I figured I'd miss out on the motorbike thing when I was 16 and get a car a year later. You could drive a car at 17 then. But when some mates who had turned 16 before me started arriving at school on motorcycles and scooters, the envy of having my own wheels set in. I wasn't allowed to have a paper round or earn anything to supplement my meagre pocket money because Dad didn't want me taking jobs away from adults, he said. Boy, was I skint. Luckily, a small commuter bike was offered for a bargain £5, which Dad bought for my 16th birthday, so personal transport seemed assured. The plan was to use the bike for a year, then take driving lessons, pass my car tests, buy a car and be a man. But teenage arrogance got in the way on a drizzly Tuesday morning in 1972 when a cocky 17-year-old failed his car test. The examiner was right to fail me. I was steady and safe, but I rolled back on a hill start. A good couple of feet. Twice. And I failed. What a plonker. 4 wheels therefore were out in favour of 2. In fact, it would be 8 full years before I would retake my car test. So this dismal day in Blackpool was the moment motorcycles rose to dominate my life. Mostly it's been great. Sometimes, just a few times, it's been horrid. So here it is, the motorcycles of my life. What they were, how they performed, and what I did with them. The 27th of May 1971, my 16th birthday, was a sunny Thursday in Blackpool. I couldn't wait to get out. The bike Dad had bought me for a £5 was roadworthy, but with a knocking big end. But Dad felt he had spent enough. He would not spend any more on repairing it. He said, "Run it until it stops, Norm." Honda's finest ran, somehow, engine knocking heavily for about 10 days, at which point it stopped. Luckily, I was near home when the death cries came. It still makes me shiver to think of the torture that I put that engine through. The severe damage caused when the big end completely disintegrated, spreading abrasive metal filings right around the engine, cost £30 to repair, about a week's wage for Dad at that time. The Honda C100 had a 49cc pushrod overhead valve engine developing 4.5 brake horsepower at 9,500 RPM. Downhill, you might see 40 miles an hour. But it was classed as a real motorcycle, as opposed to a moped, because it had no pedals. That meant that I could take my test on it, then ride any machine of any capacity. Although, as I've said, I had no plans to buy a bigger bike, passing the test allowed passengers to be carried and possibly to like rides on bigger bikes. With no training whatsoever, somehow, I passed my test just 7 weeks after being let loose on the roads. Crazily, if I'd have had enough money, I could then have ridden bikes capable of 120 mph speeds at just 16 years old. That Honda took me all around the roads of the Fylde for about 18 months. It never broke down. Did about 120 miles to the gallon on petrol, when petrol was just 7p a litre. But it did need oil changes every 300 miles, as it had no oil filter. But oil was cheap, it took less than 20 minutes to do, so I never saw it as a chore. Bargain transport it most certainly was. Once the car test was failed, and I made the decision to stick with bikes, I wanted more than the C100 could offer. But how to afford a bigger bike? By 1973, I was a second-year apprentice at a TV repair shop, earning the royal sum of £9 a week. How could I possibly afford bikes costing hundreds of pounds? Incredibly, a mate of a mate suggested he could get me a 350cc matchless if I could build him a stereo amplifier. The deal was quickly done, and the parts for the amp cost me only £7. Sadly, the bike was a real mess, whereas his amplifier was fabulous, obviously. So after some harsh words, the seller offered to reassemble the bike for me to prove it was indeed a good one. After 5 miles, the rebuilt bike ground literally to a halt, engine totally wrecked. The previous owner had left metal shavings in the oil pump gallery, which, in just those few miles, damaged almost every component in the engine. The rebuild would cost me over £80 and took a few months, but then, after that, life improved dramatically. That bike took me to the Lake District, Northampton, even Newquay in Cornwall. Now that was an epic ride. The motorway network was not finished then, and in any case, we preferred the A-roads. Me, Rick Hillman and another guy called Barry Thompson set off south on the A49. At Bamber Bridge, just 20 miles out, a part of my carburettor fell off and was lost, so it was a good job it wasn't essential. Shortly later, Rick's carb fell off completely, which caused a lot of laughter. Barry, though, upstaged us all by blowing up his 1949 Triumph Speed Twin near Tarpley in Cheshire. Yes, that was a big bang. That night we camped behind a pub in Norley, stripped the Triumph to find a hole in one of the pistons. Remarkably, a nearby bike shop had the parts as old stock. They only wanted £1 for a pair of pistons, but tight as a duck's bottom Barry asked for just one piston and paid his 50p. We broke down again in Barnstaple, this time when Rick's 250cc Royal Enfield Clipper destroyed its clutch. These old school clutches had replaceable cork inserts. Getting proper parts there and then was impossible, so we bought some bottle corks from a nearby chemist shop and sat on the pavement making clutch plate inserts with a penknife. Crazy times. It sort of worked, and we arrived at Newquay triumphant at having made it. You see, when most 18-year-olds thought 60 miles was a big run, we'd just done over 400. It was a great feeling. Matchless singles had evolved over 30 years or more. By 1973, however, it was a very outdated machine. 16 brake horsepower at 5,500 RPM was very sedate. Japanese motorcycles of half that engine capacity could slaughter it. 60 miles an hour all day was no problem. 75 for an overtake? Maybe. The brakes were below what was really safe for the traffic speeds of the 1970s, so you had to keep your wits about you. But it was easy to service with just a handful of very simple tools, which is exactly how they were designed to be. Consuming petrol at a frugal 80 miles per gallon, my 1959 350 G3 matchless took me around the country on next to no money. It owed me nothing. Dim Bucket was the unkindly nickname for the owner of Vinducket Motorcycles in Lawson's Road, Thornton. He was an accomplished motorcycle racer, which earned him some respect, but he was often rude to the younger motorcyclists and wasted no opportunity to rip you off. A 1964 ex-police 650cc Triumph Thunderbird sat in his showroom winking at me. The price was listed as £100. Mr. Duckett offered me £50 for my matchless, and the deal was done. It barely got me to 7 miles home, it was that bad. There was very little consumer protection back then, so no use at all taking the bike back. So I set about tarting the thing up. First job, an electrical rewire, dead easy. I was an electronics engineer, and anyway, the wiring on a 1964 British bike was quite basic. Before long, I was touring the Yorkshire Dales, the lakes of course, and I even went back to Newquay again. The 6T Thunderbird was a 649cc pushrod parallel twin, putting out a lowly 37 brake horsepower at about 6,500 RPM. Boy, was that bike tractable though. It could pull from 10 miles an hour in third gear without complaint and touch a true 100 in fourth gear, which was top gear of course. It was pretty good on petrol too, at about 60 miles to the gallon. These bikes had a reputation for vibration, and mine certainly did vibrate. The silencer bracket snapped due to fatigue a couple of times, and it leaked oil like no tomorrow, and I mean leaked. On the new key run, I spent more money on oil than petrol, seriously. And that vibration also caused the battery to crack open. The acid leaked out onto the frame spine, leaving a hole in it. How the heck I was able to go so far on this bike was a miracle. Yet that is what people did, if you couldn't afford better. It was also the only Triumph I've owned, surprisingly some might say, to break down and stop completely. That incident was at Runwell, near Taunton in Somerset, on the return from Newquay. The ignition advance and retard unit had come apart and magically reassembled itself in a different position, putting the ignition timing wildly out, so the engine just couldn't run. I had a great spark, but just not at the right time. To the naked eye, it looked perfect. It took me 3 hours to find out what had happened, so obscure was that fault. Camping by the pub at Runwell that night, our tent was infested by ants, while my bike laid sick beside us, needing obsolete parts. Yet we did get it sorted the next day, mainly thanks to a local dealer, Jerome & Jerome, who found me the part I needed. The Thunderbird was a good bike, although being ex-police, mine was thoroughly worn out. Goodness knows how many miles it had really done. Even so, it got me around the country. I have to say, I liked it. Having a Triumph Thunderbird, it was natural to want a Bonnie. If you were a Triumph fan, and I was, the Bonneville was the real deal. The bike I wanted was £295 at Vin Duckett's in Thornton. How we were suckers when we were young. I couldn't really afford it, but then I realised if I gave up smoking cigarettes, the money saved would cover the finance. Only 5 years old, with less than 20,000 miles on the clock, this was one very tired hack. However, it was unnaturally smooth and somewhat fast, surprising quite a few Japanese bike riders as well as me. After a full rewire, new carburetors and countless other parts, the bike was returned to a half-decent condition. Yet something wasn't quite right. It would drink petrol at an alarming rate, less than 40 miles per gallon, when it should have been closer to 60. And the engine oil would go black within 2 or 3 miles of an oil change. Something had to be done about that. Dismantling the top end revealed that the right-hand piston had completely lost 2 of its 3 piston rings. The gap between the piston and the cylinder was so large, the rings had simply jumped out of their grooves and been smashed to pieces, then expelled out of the exhaust. The valves and the valve guides were also completely shot. How this engine ran at all was a miracle. How it ran so smoothly and went so quickly was nothing short of black magic. During the remedial work, I used some scientific scales at the technical college to try and ensure that the engine retained its smoothness once reassembled. I recall filing milligrams off each new piston so they weighed exactly the same. Did it work? Did it hell? The bike ran very cleanly, did 60 miles to the gallon, kept its oil clean. But it was just never as quick as before, and it vibrated like all Triumph twins, that is, badly. But it was a Bonnie, and I sort of loved it. If I still had it, it would be worth over 20 grand. See, 1969 was one of the best model years for the Bonnie. By the summer of 1975, the M55 motorway to Blackpool was opened, and I couldn't resist blasting up and down it when I thought there was no police about. A 650 Bonnie would do a true 105 to 110 miles per hour, maybe 120 on the clock. There were faster Japanese bikes, of course, but I didn't really like them. I didn't like the way they read more highly, generally handled poorly, and rusted more quickly than British bikes. Remember, we're talking 1975 here. 10 years on, the Japanese had sorted these issues and made truly astonishing products. But for now, the Bonnie was king in my mind. As a friend came slowly past me on his Trident one day, I gave the Bonnie full throttle. We were going uphill on the motorway out of Blackpool, and I guess I made 105 miles an hour, tucked in as tight as I could. As Tony drew alongside, he changed down a gear and simply disappeared up the hill. I could not believe the Trident had so much more power than a Bonnie. A week later, I owned one. BSA Triumph had collapsed and had become Norton Villiers Triumph, NVT, a company aided by the government with the aim to try and save the remnants of the British motorcycle industry. Nevertheless, by 1975, the end was near. It didn't put me off, but it did mean that finding a new Trident wasn't so straightforward. After a few dozen phone calls, I tracked one down in Scotland for £971. I had a well-paid job by this time. My bank readily granted me the necessary loan, and I rode my Bonnie the nearly 200 miles to Lloyd's Motorcycles in Hamilton to do the deal. The early September sun shone warmly as my new three-cylinder Triumph purred back south to Blackpool. It was very smooth compared to the twins, and significantly more powerful. But it drank juice all right. I think 35 miles to the gallon on that first gentle run was all I got. I didn't care. It was my first brand new motorcycle, and it looked gorgeous in the late summer sunshine. The following year, 1976, was blessed with great weather. My annual mileage was soaring due to this and my attendance at motorcycle rallies. Motorcycle rallies are gatherings of bikers for the purposes of getting there and getting back, with drinking and camping thrown in. There was no sport involved. Me and my mates would finish work on a Friday afternoon, ride hundreds of miles to a rally, camp Friday, Saturday nights, then ride home. You got a badge to prove you'd done it. It became quite a craze. In this manner, I covered 21,000 miles in just 11 months on the Trident. All this while using another bike for going to work. Although this Triumph had been built in a factory about to close by staff knowing their jobs would soon end, the quality of my machine was very good. It never broke down. It didn't leak oil. It was faster than most Japanese bikes, despite what others who weren't there at the time might tell you. It also handled well and had decent brakes. It did, however, have two serious drawbacks. Firstly, the maintenance required was excessive. I think this is why many historians say the Honda CB750 was quicker than the Trident. You see, a Trident would go off tune in a few hundred miles, whereas the Hondas were brilliant in that regard. Every Wednesday night, I would have to check the valve clearances, reset the ignition timing, synchronise the three carburetors, and adjust the primary chain. This was in addition to what you would have to do, say, on a Honda, which was simply to check the final drivetrain, lubricate it, and top up the battery with distilled water, maybe check the oil levels. I have to tell you, servicing the Trident was tiresome. It was worth it though. My bike was timed at 126 miles an hour on the M55 by a friendly policeman who is still alive and therefore shall remain anonymous.
Will this work for you? I can't seem to find my license, but...
The second drawback turned out to be the elephant's foreskin, and you don't get any bigger drawbacks than that. By mid-1976, the main BSA Triumph factory had closed, leading to a spares shortage. At 21,000 miles, my Trident needed a new gearbox sprocket and rear wheel sprocket due to normal wear and tear. With none being available at that time, and my annual mileage being so high, sadly the Trident had to go. It was a difficult situation because I did not like the engine characteristics of Japanese bikes. Italian bikes were too fragile at that time. BMWs were simply too expensive. that we don't talk about Harleys. One way to get a flying start to a rally after work on a Friday evening was to have the Trident at home, fully loaded, ready to rock and roll. Clearly this would require another bike to get me to and from work. So when a Triumph Tiger Cub, a sports cub no less, became available, I jumped right in. The previous owner was Barry Thompson, the same guy who blew up his 500cc twin on the way to Newquay. I knew the bike would be held together with string. No problem. I intended to fully overhaul the engine, rewire the electrics and repaint the bike to boot. T20SH Tiger Cubs were 200cc single-cylinder motorcycles producing 16 brake horsepower at 6,700 RPM. Good enough for 70 miles an hour at a push, certainly adequate for my daily commute to Solwick. As a bonus, it was miserly on petrol, yielding an average of about 100 miles per gallon on a long run. Now, Cubs had a reputation for weak engines, particularly the big end bearings. So when I rebuilt mine, steps were taken to use stronger components developed for grass track racing, as well as using a larger oil pump. I covered 18,000 miles on this bike, and it was totally reliable, with the caveat that maintenance was done regularly and very carefully. It was also great fun to ride, so much so that at Easter 1976, I took it to the West Cumberland Safari Rally near Egremont, traversing the infamous Rhinos and Hard Knock passes with their 1 in 3 or 33% gradients. The Cub romped up the hills and careered down them. The brakes were a tad weak, but no bother at all really. My bike had a high level exhaust, which looked great, but it didn't have a heat shield, so I burnt my right leg a time or two, but hey. It was also noisy. The police stopped me a few times, but didn't book me because the exhaust system was stamped up factory original. It was definitely too loud. I don't know how Triumph got away with selling them like that. I can't remember why I sold the Cub, but I do remember how much enjoyment it brought me. A Suzuki advert in 1976 quoted Barry Sheene as saying, "It's a bloody good motorbike." It also boasted about the low-speed torque. Could this be the Trident's replacement? I took the risk, no demonstrator bike being available, and jumped right in. I found the low down power, or torque, to be weak compared to British bikes. I found the twin disc front brake was too sharp in the dry and useless in the wet. Sintered brake pads had not been invented yet. Still, the Trident single disc was much more effective in the rain and in the dry. Fuel consumption was just plain ridiculous. Its worst trait though was the handling. Several different tyre combinations were tried, but I never felt confident with the steering. But what was it like overall to live with? At the Tartan Valley in 1976, the bike ran very roughly after riding down a 5-mile unmade road. It was bumpy, but nothing too extreme. I discovered the spark plugs had been badly burnt away. I had to fit harder plugs that could take more heat, but these got us back to Blackpool, where it was found that the carburettor float levels were all very low, leading to a lean fuel-air mixture that frazzled the plugs. The Mikuni carbs used old-fashioned brass floats. The weight of these bouncing up and down on that rough road knocked all the levels out. It's ridiculous. A couple of months later, I took Tony Reddy on the back to the Chasewater Rally near Stafford. 900 bikers attended that rally, all needing a Sunday morning poo, yet there was only one toilet. We quickly rolled up the tent and rode the short distance to Kiel service area on the M6 to do our number 2s in more comfort. When we got there, some football coaches had just arrived and the queue for the bogs was serious. Being a bit desperate, I filled the Suzuki to the brim with petrol and set off home at some pace. I reckon we'd make it back in well under an hour if I could cruise at 100. but my Suzuki, that was road tested at 120 miles an hour, cannot maintain more than 90, with us two 16-stone giants plus a tent on board. Full throttle in fourth gear was all she'd pull. It just slowed down in top. On paper, it had 14 brake horsepower more than the Trident. On the road, it felt like 14 less. Oh! By Kirkham on the M55, it went onto the reserve fuel tank, which equated to, wait for it, where it was really quick was the speed at which it corroded. Careful washing, drying and polishing would be repaid with rusty wheels, handlebars, horn and other parts by the next day. We used to say they were built for California, not for Lancashire. Okay, enough of the downsides. What about the good? It was supremely comfortable. The engine, being a rubber-mounted 3-cylinder water-cooled 2-stroke, was very smooth. The quality of the engine and gearbox was fantastic. I'd heard of kettles covering 70,000 miles and more with no bother, exceptional for a 2-stroke. It was also my first bike with an electric start, which, by the way, worked first time, every time. I know some riders love their kettles, and I respect that. Sadly, it didn't work for me. Mine went after just 5 months and 7,000 miles. My experiment with Japanese bikes had failed. The manufacturers from the land of the rising sun had yet to discover mid-range torque, decent handling and chrome that would last a British winter. BMWs were not far off twice the price of an equivalent Japanese bike. In February 1977, I could have bought a new 750 Honda for just over £1,000. Instead, I crashed out on a 2.5-year-old BMW R75/6 for £1,275. Was I going mad? Nick Jeffries did the deal with me at Alan Jeffries Motorcycles in Shipley, West Yorkshire, and a 65-mile ride home from there was a revelation. By no means a perfect bike, it welded me to BMW motorcycles for the next 22 years. The engine was so over-engineered, it developed a mere 50 brake horsepower at 6,200 RPM, but turned in a respectable 50 miles to the gallon. The power characteristics were very similar to a British bike, with rich, smooth torque throughout the rev range. The clunky gearbox was something you had to get used to, but the shaft drive made up for that. No more messing about with chains. Yippee! But let's not get too rosy. It did have its foibles. Below 2,500 RPM, if you laid on too much throttle, the engine would shake a bit, so you learn not to do it. There was a vibration patch at about 5,000 RPM, but nothing like a British twin, or even the Trident come to that. They also tended to blow out rear crankshaft oil seals, a fault BMW wouldn't totally cure for another 20 years. My bike had electric start, but no kickstarter as a backup. Since I was using the bike 365 days a year, this meant an occasional push start in sub-zero conditions. The single front disc brake, twin discs were an expensive option then, was very poor. No, these bikes were a long way from perfect, but once I learned to service and work on them, they were truly a pleasure to own. In late 1977, me and Tony Reddy went down to the Knotted Bear rally at Blandford Forum. The Sunday morning ride home was a right blast, I can tell you. Up the A37 to Bristol and onto the M5, whence the throttle was pinned right back to the stop, and it stayed there for 95% of the way home. With us two fatties on board and camping gear, the R75 stayed at 100 miles an hour on the flat and up the hills. As we unloaded Tony's things outside his home in Blackpool, the Boxer twin sat there on its side stand, gently bubbling away, with not a rattle to be heard. In fact, it sounded like we'd just had a trot around the block, not a 270-mile thrash from Dorset. Brilliant stuff. Those of us that do a lot of miles will inevitably have an accident. One day in 1978 on the M62 near Prestwich, a rain shower had left the road surface very greasy. Traffic on my side of the motorway, the westbound side, sensibly slowed down to about 20 miles an hour. On the other side, an accident was in progress. A car coming up quick behind us had not noticed everybody had slowed down as he was watching the crash. The driver lost control, his Mark III Ford Cortina missed me by a whisker before stopping side on right in front of me. At first the car was on its side, but luckily it fell back onto its wheels just in time for me to hit it. Even at 20 miles an hour I could not stop on that slippery road. Luckily I wasn't hurt, I didn't even fall off, but the bike was badly damaged. Bent forks, bent frame, loads of stuff smashed. At BMW prices, it wasn't going to be pretty. Yet thanks to a good lawyer, I rebuilt the bike myself in 10 days and got the £1,800 cheque from the car driver in my bank as well. Result. In just 18 months, GKB 26N carried me over 35,000 mostly enjoyable miles. When I traded it in with 52,000 miles on the clock, the dealer commented, "It sounds better than a new one." Can't say better than that, can you?